wanted to start by saying that I think that the topic that we're talking about today, challenges of school education in India, and can technology solve the problem? A big thing that comes up when we think about technology is we assume it's the great equalizer. It's the thing that can democratize access. To get started, I'd love for you to each just share with us in a few sentences, about your own experience working in education technology.
You want to start? All right. So I work on Google for Education, and the focus that we have is to impact student learning by bringing the best of Google to the education community. I think the one big realization that I've had while working the space is that there's so many ways of having impact out there, right from helping teachers be more productive so that they can focus on student learning, getting feedback back to students quicker, as well as just making technology more affordable and at scale available to schools through things like Chromebooks. There's just so many ways of having impact. And I think the other big realization that I've had working in the space is teachers are a passionate group of users. For the products that we work on, we get tons of feedback from them very frequently, which really helps us in the cycle of iterating and improving what we have for them out there.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your work experience?
Yeah, so I work with Pratham, and I don't know how many people here know much about Pratham. The name means primary or first in several Indian languages. And so we are about 25 years old. When we started, our goal, and it still is our goal, is that every child in school and learning well. And we've, much of the work that we've done in the last, I would say 15 years, has been largely focused on the fact that we have in India very high enrollment rates now, 96, 95% for the elementary school age group. But we have a lot of children who may go through school 4 or 5 years of schooling without really being able to acquire even basic reading or basic math. And so we've spent a large part of our focus in kind of figuring out how do you help kids do that in school, in the community, how do you help them to do that really quickly, because you have so much way to go, but without these foundational skills you can't get there. And while we've been aware of technology being a potential source, I would say it's really only in the last 5 or 6 years, and maybe it coincides a lot with the price of devices having really fallen and internet connectivity really having expanded in India, that we've really devoted a whole set of people within the organization to figure out how in this kind of journey for learning well does technology play a role. And I want to add, although it's really dark here, that while I'm on the stage, I have many colleagues here in the audience, and including Madhav, who's sitting somewhere, who actually leads our digital learning. He's the founder of Pratham, and he also leads our kind of experiments or exploration of how technology can help.
Amazing.
So any question that you ask me that I can't answer?
We'll defer then to the audience, it sounds like.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, I think that there's different levels of understanding right now in the room in terms of what the different challenges are in India for education. And so, I know that for the work that I've done, just sheer scale, sheer number of youths in a country where the majority of students are, working and living with communities that are new, working in regions that aren't necessarily super industrialized, has always had a big impact on the work that I've done. But I was wondering if you could share with the audience here, what are some of the biggest challenges just for education in India? And if you were to pick just one, what is maybe the most challenging?
I already told you what I think is the biggest one, but I think that there are certain assumptions that we make about how education should be, which often are the biggest challenges. So for example, not just in India, in many parts of the world, schools we think school is the place where bulk of education happens. That's assumption number one that I think we are in some ways beginning to challenge quite a bit. And that schools are actually organized in a very linear way. You're a particular age, you're 6 years old, you're in first grade. By the time you're 10 years old, you're in fifth grade. And the way you proceed through the system is through kind of almost like a linear curriculum that you're supposed to master as you move on. And this is a very standard way in which even people who haven't been to school can see this is how school is organized. But if you look at actually the reality, at least of the Indian situation, and now we are beginning to learn about other countries, and we see it's pretty similar there, that there are kids of different ages in all of these grades. So there's a lot of diversity even within the age distribution per grade. And there's certainly a lot of diversity about where kids are at. So you could be, for example, if I give you an Indian example, in 5th grade, we have about 50% of kids who are definitely at like a 2nd grade level, and some are even above. But kids who are at 5th grade level varies dramatically across the country, and it's probably a national average of 20%. But a 5th grade teacher who's teaching from the 5th grade curriculum and the textbooks is actually teaching 5th grade stuff, which means that in a public school, in a government school, you're leaving behind 80%. And there is no catch-up mechanism, no mechanism for helping those who are not at grade level to move through the system. So you increasingly leave more and more kids behind. And for the kids who are left behind, so for the 20%, I mean, every Indian that you know in New York is in that 20%. They all learned to read by 1st grade and hopefully did much more after that. But for the ones who are the bulk who are left behind, the learning pathway is flat, and the learning opportunities outside of the curriculum that's left them behind is 0.
Right.
So I would say that this whole issue of who learns what and how is, I think, the biggest challenge, because almost all Indian children have access to a school. But once you're through the school, what happens inside the school, or what happens outside the school? The tutoring. I mean, our tutoring business in India is huge, and even more tightly focused on curriculum and individual excellence than perhaps even what happens in school.
Right.
So these assumptions, I think, need to change if we want to do learning for all.
And just to add to what Rukmini was mentioning, I think there's a couple of core issues at play as well about why the learning doesn't happen at school. I think infrastructural issues we're well aware of. There's schools don't have bathrooms. 50% of schools don't have bathrooms for female students. As well as just thinking about number of teachers which are available and in the system. I think it's like the teacher to student ratio in India is 35:1, which is student to teacher ratio is 35:1, and in US that's like 12:1. So you already see a massive factor of difference in just the help available to the students, which is also a big issue.
When we think about what Google is doing specifically in education and talking about things like literacy, talking about students being pushed linearly through a system without necessarily given the opportunity to catch up, to fill the gap of the learning that they should have in order to progress to the next grade, is that a similar theme that Google for Education takes a look at?
I think there's a lot of initiatives that we have which also focus on student learning directly. I think a good example that comes to mind is Google Bolo, which is an app which we recently launched. So for those of you who don't know about it, Google Bolo is an app which is like an personalized instructor for students who are learning language. And what it does is it gives you activities, and through the power of technology, it understands what you are saying and what level you are at, and it helps you, make it more engaging so that you can build your understanding of the subject and improve as you proceed. So some of those efforts are really focused on, direct student learning, and I think you'll continue to see us investing more in that direction.
And do you see big differences between some of the complications that we're seeing in classrooms domestically and the classrooms that we're seeing in India? I think one of the best points that you made here is just the ratio of student to teacher. I mean, that's quite noticeably different. There's quite a bit more students in a classroom in India. But are there any similarities to the problems that we're having in domestic education to that teachers are facing in classrooms in India?
I think achievement gap comes to mind. Even in the US, I think there's a big disparity in how students of lower income groups or specific demographics learn and what their achievement level is at, versus the schools which are more well-to-do off in better areas. And I think in India as well, you see the same thing with urban-rural divide. So there are definitely similarities. I think in the US, there's a lot more infrastructural support now with EdTech, which promises a change. Yeah. I think India is a little further away from that.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Well, just to bring it back to India, you know, in a country where internet access is sometimes an issue in many regions, how does your organization work to navigate that?
So I would say the approach that we've taken to kind of start exploring what technology can do, you know, if I had to just describe it very quickly, we have about 1,000 villages where we've been focused on how do you introduce and work with technology to help learning. We call it hybrid learning because we think that it's a combination of things done together that actually makes a big difference. Now, what is exactly, you know, if you're cooking and you have all these different spices and you have to keep kind of, trying different things to get the taste to be just right. And in that same way, I think we have 4 or 5 pieces of what we are trying to put together, and it's been evolving over these. And I'll just go through what those pieces are. One is, as I described, we feel that for these explorations, the school environment is often very constrained. You know, both time, curriculum, what teachers are required to do, you know, gives you very little space. So you want to explore freely, then there's a big time outside school. The second thing is, you know, we believe that school pushes you towards individual performance and excellence, but we see that almost anything that kids do outside school is not individual. I mean, all of India knows how to play cricket, and nobody put them through a curriculum to do that. You know, you basically learned it by hanging out with your friends in the neighborhood and being in actually heterogeneous groups. And so what we are doing in our hybrid learning is actually having kids, so any village that we are in, every kid in that particular age group is part of a group. You can see the picture here. You can also see a little intruder in there who is probably looking the most keen because he's not in the supposed age group he should be at. But he's probably somebody's, you know, younger brother who said, I need to be here, and nobody is asking him to leave. So we work in groups, and we've been asked, do you do that because you don't have enough tablets? You know, is this a response to scarcity, or is this a desirable? And I think our view right now is that actually being in a group together adds to the entire group's learning. Another thing that we think is very important, which I mean, I'm sure is addressed in other cases, that you've got to want to learn. You've got to be motivated to learn, and so you need a whole variety of ways in which to explore if you are interested. Big surveys in India who ask kids who are not in school or who aren't attending why, the answer is usually not the economic situation of the family. The answer is not interested. And I think that's a very key thing about figuring out why should you learn? I mean, you learn only, why do you learn to play cricket? It's because everybody else is doing it and it's the hot thing to do. And so the group learning, the idea that it's not just what is the technology input to your group, but that this is a two-way process. And so a whole variety of things about how do you choose what you want to do, how do you convince your group what to do, how does everybody contribute. And so we are looking at the place of technology in this entire social organization as an important place, but I think embedding it into a social structure is important as well, because it's the human interaction over the activity that actually adds to it. What you can't see in the picture is that there's a whole family set up around, because part of our school education, part of the successful thing of our school education is that it leaves everybody else behind. If your mom is not educated, she cannot participate, and she's not encouraged to participate in your growth at all. Whereas in some of these kinds of settings, it's open. So, you know, there may be a grandma sitting right behind who may be as much of a participant. And again, I think that's a true learning behavior, is people learn from life because there's lots of other people involved in your life. I mean, I can go on and on, but I would say we see that our technology part has been evolving, our social organization part has been evolving, our interaction of what content in the tab versus what activities outside, what combinations are useful. And I think finally, you know, how do we learn from this entire process? How do you assess, is this making a difference? That also has been quite a journey.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point. And when I think about, you know, domestic education, there's always a phrase that, online education democratizes access to it. An example of that would be a company like 2U or Noodle, which take courses from universities and put them online. So a larger pool of individuals can take that course from the comfort of their own home. Tools like Duolingo obviously create environments where anyone with free time can learn a new language. But the linchpin is you have to be very intrinsically motivated. You have to be a very active participant. And so that's where I think it is so interesting, the collaboration, the community, the environment in which you guys are trying to implement some of these interventions is so important. With that said, if you were to think about, in the ways in which technology does democratize access, is it simply getting curriculum into these settings is the most, noticeable difference? Or what are the other ways that technology has opened up a world of learning to students in India?
I think I think technology democratizes the education in several different ways. I think when I think about the knowledge which is available to students out there for access, it's just grown so rapidly in the last few years because of technology. The example of Khan Academy and YouTube come to mind, where there's so much available if you're willing to learn, that it kind of really bridges that barrier of just having access to content. I think another big way in which technology kind of democratizes education is, it helps learners of different pace kind of learn at their own pace, right? So with technology in the US, we're seeing paradigms like flipped classrooms and differentiated learning, which really helps students, go at their own pace and proceed at their own pace at what they're comfortable. So I think those are, and apart from that, you also mentioned about, learning from anywhere. Distance learning is taking off so much in higher ed now. Although I think in primary education, it's the impact is still limited. I hope that changes in the future. But those were some of the things which came to mind.
I'll give you a few examples. This democracy is a loaded word.
Very much so.
So I would call it, I'm not sure I have the right word. I'll give you an example, and maybe that will explain. One is, here's an example. This is from a while back. There was a group of kids like this, and they had a whole bunch of things that they were, using their little tablet that they had for. And one of the things was a whole series of experiments that you actually could watch and then do yourself. And I was talking to this group, and I said, which is your favorite experiment? And there was something which had a magnet and a leaf and a bowl of water, or something. I forget now the details. And so I said, can you show me? Because, if you really like it. So everybody went and got the bowl and the leaf and the magnet and, so on and so forth. And this big rush, 4 or 5 kids, the experiment didn't quite work like it was supposed to. They were all kind of irritated with each other. And then there was grandma sitting at the back. And this was in a village in UP in central India. And she had her head covered because there were some men around. And she got really irritated by all this. She flipped her head scarf and she said, let me show you. And she did it right. And then she was laughing, saying, I hang out with these kids because, they're all sitting on the, on the veranda. I didn't even know I knew how to do this. That's, I think, a big way in which this learning is not restricted to, the kids and the linear. And I think that this, it's hard to measure what, something like this does to the whole community. But this is one example. A second example is we've done this more in the summer because the kids have a lot of free time. Last summer, the kids got, and we have all these, thousands of groups. And so the kids were told you can make a video on, let's say, mangoes. Hundreds of videos were made. Nobody told the kids what exactly to do, but they figured it out. Partly they're available of cell phone technology in India and anywhere else in the world. Taking photographs and videos are just the first natural thing that everyone begins to do. But how do you make a script? How do you put in special effects? How do you put in music? Kids were able to do a huge amount. And so much so that how do you choose what are the best, very different themes. Somebody did, how does my mother make a mango pickle? Others did, what are the different mango trees in our village? And we have a huge source of data of stuff on mangoes. Each village in these 1,000 villages had to put up a jury. Films were screened.
Wow.
And then the best were uploaded.
Wow.
Now, this was made possible because we realized that these tabs have cameras. So you can do the two-way transfer. It's not just, Mr. Khan. His name is Khan, right?
Yeah.
There is a Mr. Khan.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Mr. Khan is giving us stuff, and I'm looking at it, and I'm learning. This is, 20,000 kids are making stuff and exchanging it. I mean, I think that's a huge way in which this can move ahead. This summer, we had music in your village. I mean, these kids in some villages have gone and found out every single person who can sing, who can play an instrument, had videos of those, audio recordings. I mean, this is like wiki life. And to me, I mean, this is what all of this makes possible.
Well, I think that I have two important follow-ups based on your comment. And I think the first is, we are at Google. So why don't you go ahead and define for us what is both the hardware and the software that's most instrumental in you delivering your programs?
Oh, now for the hardware, I need some. Can we
have some audience participation?
Yes. Madhav, can you tell us?
Of course, it's an Android tablet. We do not give internet connectivity on that. We try not to give that because that's a risky business. If the parents want the children to have internet, then they can give internet separately. The important aspect of the tablets and now the growing technology is that we can use the software side of it. We're increasingly using speech to text and text to speech. There are some parts of it that Google won't give us and use it for itself. But our hackers have figured out what to do. And that is very important because in the education technology business, so far, the games have been the click and drag and drop and things like that. But this is giving more interactivity. Bolo app is the first one that talks about letting you read and so on. We've been doing that as well. Now, where this finally leads to is when you read a text, comprehension of a text is very important. And if you say, give a kid a text of, say, 300 words and ask questions, then you can ask questions that are simple fact retrieval. So you should be able to just outline those and you get the answer, right? You can just pick the sentence which has the answer to the question. What was the name of the dog? The dog was called Puppy. Okay, so that sentence you highlight and you give the answer. There are other ways where you need to draw inference, where you can give speech to text. So you ask me a question, I give the answer in words, which comes out in text, and then it's analyzed for whether the answer is correct or not, or close to where it is. So these are the technologies that we are evolving. Also, you asked a question whether this was in the absence of internet connectivity, how do you deal with this? So all these are offline usually. All our software is offline. That is part of the problem. But the way we are trying to overcome this is that we also have a Raspberry Pi based computer which is given to the older volunteers. And that with a large memory size, we use it as a repository so that a lot of software, videos, etc., that can be used for learning purposes are stored there. And the kids can go there and like draw water, take what they want. They can dump their own videos on the computer. And that computer, which is a little more controlled, is connected to the cloud. So when we want, we can upload information, download data, and stuff like that.
Wonderful.
I think that's as far as I can
That was a
go with
great
the
answer. Yes. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of the hardware that's, and Google's perspective on what some of the innovation should be in this hardware space?
Yeah, I think the focus for us has been to make it more affordable. So the efforts that we've had with Chromebook, I think one of the reasons Chromebook has been so successful is that schools have been able to adopt them at scale because of the cost, the low cost associated with them. I think very recently we also started investigating. I think we recently launched a Chromebook tablet, which is even cheaper than that. I think we continue to find ways to do it. My hope is that in future, as the prices for the core components that go into building these devices go down, and we have more innovation in the space, we'll see devices which are more affordable, and the penetration for those is going to increase across the world and not just in the developed world.
And I think the affordability is an important component that you just mentioned. I also think it's the teacher training, because of the classrooms that I've worked in, the teachers have continuous access to resources and support on making sure they can share with students how to leverage the Chromebooks in their studies.
Oh, absolutely. I think in the US, what we see is most of the adoption of technology is through teachers. And I mean, in some ways, at least the devices were available. But if you can tie the incentives which teachers have with technological innovation, the benefits trickle down to the students. I think one good example that comes to mind is Google Classroom, which we launched about 5 years ago. And what that does is it helps you move away from paper as a teacher. You don't have to go and print everything. You don't have to give everything out to students and collect it back. The consequence of that is everything is moving to online in classes which we're using Classroom, which in turn helps teachers get back to students faster and give them feedback faster, which helps overall with their learning. So I definitely cannot emphasize enough how focusing also on the teacher matters in this context.
Yeah, very good point. Well, the next thing that I wanted to bring up was the one of measurement. I think that when you're working with students, and now they're obviously working these beautiful cohorts outside of the classroom, the act of measuring progress can be a difficult one. And I know from my experience working in the nonprofit world, the amount of grants that I was reporting on very late at night, pulling data from lots of different sources, it's a very large task for a nonprofit to be able to do and to do well. Can you share with us, how are you guys measuring progress, both tactically how you're doing it, and what are the important metrics that you're tracking?
So, in a typical education sense, there is a whole history of measurement. Again, you're measuring usually individual proficiency in a subject matter. That's how, and that's typically in the old-fashioned way done on pen and paper, and now you can do it on tablets. That's the typical way to do it. We have, over the last 15 years, done some very basic and very simple, fast measurements of basic reading and math. We were, in fact, earlier supported by Google.org at some stage actually to do this. We do a big survey every year called the Annual Status of Education Report. The acronym is ASER, which happens in India in many Indian languages to mean impact. And that's done in every district in India every year. So, 750,000 kids are assessed every year on basic reading and math. So, of course, those are, we can do those very easily. I think the real challenge, and I think it's not just in these kinds of settings, but I would say you could even think about the same thing in a classroom setting, is that there is a lot more happening which supports learning, which is not measured. Confidence is a big one. Feeling like I want to try something is another big one. The ability to communicate in many different ways, not just in, either on the tablet or, I think these are all, key pieces. How do you measure motivation? How do you track choice? Because kids are choosing things. How do you track, for example, we think about learning, you can think about learning in many dimensions, but if you think that there is one kind of learning which says, I know something about many things. There are some things that I know in a little bit more depth. So, any one of us has all these different dimensions, right? So one is, I would say, exposure. I know keywords, I can associate terms with a family of terms. Let's say if that's the initial part of, understanding or beginning to know something, then there may be slightly deeper understanding that I'm able to do some causation, some connections, and then there could be something that we call knowledge, which could be, all of these and more. I think that with, with the availability of a variety of technology, you should be able to do these, not just for individuals, but also for groups. So is a classroom where all of this stuff is going on very different from a classroom where this is not going on? Is a village or a community where all of this is going on? Is a family where dad works at Google very different, or mom works at Google very different from a family where the dad or mom are, selling vegetables? I think these are the really exciting things to think about and very difficult to measure.
Right.
And perhaps I know my colleagues have been saying, body language changes when you become confident. Is there a way that the tab can see that, what you were like before versus what you're like now. Or the way you react to a topic that is your passion versus the algebra you had to do. And how do you measure those? So I think that the world of assessment has to really change quite a bit. We have to figure out, and we've been hunting for some of these things, and I think that the world of education measurement has been standardized into kind of an OECD level. And despite all these good ratios in the US, test scores have not really changed. So there isn't this, I think that, while there's a great, slight digression, there's a great film from about 10 years ago called 2 Million Minutes. And it tracks 2 million minutes is the number of minutes that goes from 9th grade till the end of high school. And they track 3 pairs of kids who are going through high school, one in Shanghai, one somewhere in the Midwest, and one in Bangalore. And you look at where these kids are headed and what are the people around them saying. And I think one of the big things that comes out is I shouldn't let out we should go see the film.
Yeah, we should all have film at the end for it.
But the fact is that this thing called a high school graduate is so different in these 3 places, and yet on test scores, the Shanghai kids are doing really well, the Bangalore kids are in the middle, but clearly they are the unhappiest in all of this. And the American kids look like they're all over the place and they're spending all their time in proms, but they actually can do choice. They have confidence, they can take decisions. So it's an old-fashioned film, but it raises questions about what kind of kid are you producing and what do you want them to do?
Yeah.
But the measurements that you're doing in school is on your test scores.
Can I just add to that a little bit more?
Please, yes.
I think my personal perspective on this is that some of the measurements that we have today in how we measure student progress, I mean, the roots exist for those from the 18th century.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's been limited by what paper and pencil could have done. But when you think about what letter grades and point values mean, when we say a student got 75% marks or points, what does that actually mean, right? What did they learn and what did they not learn? And where should they go next with their learning, right? And that is where I think the technology enables us ways now to measure student progress in different ways, which is more based on proficiency of what they understand. And that can fundamentally change, just a conversation about what are we optimizing for, what are the incentives for students? Is it earning marks or is it, achieving mastery? And to what Rukmini was mentioning, I think there's so much standardized testing that happens, but I think the fundamental question of what an assessment needs to change. It just needs to be formative in the sense it should be used to a large extent by teachers to understand where students are rather than just assign points and assign grades.
Right.
And I think that has a lot of potential impact for it to have in the future.
Yeah, I think the conversation around social and emotional learning domestically has become quite a robust one. How can we measure things like confidence, motivation, in addition to what letter grades they're getting or what test scores they're getting? And there are some interesting tools here in the US that are trying to combine tracking that information with actual test scores, but it is still very difficult as there is no one standard set yet to do so. But certainly have been seeing a lot of innovations domestically in that space and encouraged to hear that that's something that you guys are thinking about as well. Before we talk, about what the future holds, I think that the last thing that's come up quite a bit is the role of the teacher. And I know that's something that Google Classroom is very passionate about. I know the software that my company builds is very educator first because we talk a lot about how technology impacts students, but let's talk a little bit more about how do we support the teacher and how do we leverage the interventions that you guys are doing or the technology that you guys are building to better support these teachers, many of which it sounds like have far too many students in their classroom.
I mean, if I take the Indian context and, we run in our, usual mainstream programs in Pratham, a large number of projects with the government system. And so there I would say the teacher is one piece of the system. Many education reforms are directed at the teacher and not at the whole, if I came into Google and targeted only one level of person or whatever, one project team and ignored everybody else, the chances that it would move, I don't know about Google, maybe that will work here. But in our system, which is very hierarchical and very top down, you have to think about what is the goal and is the system organized to reach that goal. And given that our learning, there is a expected learning kind of trajectory and there is a reality. So it also depends on how we are addressing the gap between the reality and the expectation. Because part of it is that everybody is directed at the expected path and ignores the reality, which then means that education reforms have failed because we actually targeted the work at a different place. So the most successful, and this is, I think, a general principle that we've learned. It's not just about any effort that has technology in it, is that you have to think about how the whole thing is going to support the initiative that you're aiming at. Teachers in India, and I'm sure in many parts of the world, are very isolated. You're alone in your classroom with kids and maybe with some technology for a long time. But who helps you? In all other professions, you're scaffolded as a key unit. You're scaffolded and helped a lot. And typically, teachers in India are very alone. Everything that we do in Pratham, we do firstly directed at the level above the teacher. So who is it that interacts? Who is the person in the system who's likely to visit schools often, who's likely to interact with teachers on a regular basis? And if that person is not a leader of practice, then it's very hard to think that the teacher will change. And so this leader of practice could be somebody who has 20 schools under them, 15 schools under them, and so on. There's a tendency in some parts of our education system to replace that person with an app. And while maybe it can be done very well in some settings, I think still we need the human interaction of I've done what I'm asking you to do before, and I come into your classroom and you have a problem, and I work with you to help you sort out that problem. I demonstrate what you can do with kids and so on. And this leader of practice has to be linked to the higher level decision makers who also think that all of this. So there is a top-down alignment which is really needed, because very often we have teacher-directed effort and then everybody blames the teacher if it doesn't go well. And if it goes well, then the top guy takes the credit. So I don't know here, for example, domestically, what are the interactions that you've had with teacher unions? Because they are a big part of the life of a teacher, and in orienting them to really, a teachers' union is for teachers, but it's also for teaching. And so I think that, the main point is I think that this teacher has to be supported both from the system as well as from the parents.
Gotcha.
And there's got to be these connections made if you want this person to be as effective as possible.
Yeah, and I think that you have some similar feelings about that here at Google as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think our perspective, and a pretty strong perspective, is that you can never replace the need for great teachers. And the efforts for EdTech, I think we need to focus a lot more on helping teachers to get their students where they need to be, both in terms of making them more productive, but also helping them understand where their students are at. And that's the kind of helping see which set of students have different needs than the other one, having that kind of enabling differentiated learning in classes is something which we can help teachers provide instruction better, teachers be more effective in classes. But overall, I think the perspective of focusing on teachers solving their needs so that we can impact students is a strong one, and I think that's something that we always keep in mind as we proceed. Yeah.
Well, before we open up questions from the audience, there's one last question I want to ask both of you. You're both, apart from the organizations that you're up here representing, you're just both great leaders in education. And so aside from, any of the necessarily day-to-day work that you might do, we just love both of your perspectives of, what do you think is the most exciting innovation happening right now in EdTech? And if we were to check back with you a year from now, how will the world be different because that innovation is available?
I think one very boring innovation, which is going to be impactful, is just bringing down the cost of hardware and connectivity. I think it's, yes, that'll happen. But when you think about it, in India, half of the population still does not have a smartphone or connectivity, internet connectivity, or even more. My facts are probably wrong there. But I think just like we think of electricity as a utility, I can't wait to see a phase where connectivity and having access to technology is just assumed, because that opens up such a big just scope for you to learn better and learn more and have access to the universe of knowledge out there. And the other thing which I'm really excited about is artificial intelligence. I think at some point in the future we'll have a better understanding of semantically what the content is about and where the student understanding is. And when you think about organizing world's information through what the content actually means and pairing that with what students know or kids know, I think that has a great potential in future as I see it.
Very interesting. Same question for you.
But two things, and I'm not a technology person at all. One is I think this whole speech to text and text to speech stuff, I think is probably in its very early stages, because a large part of opportunities not being available is restrictions of language, and therefore how this can break, these barriers of language, I think could be, quite exciting. But I don't know what the technology behind that is. I understand from my colleagues that it's more complicated. But the second thing is, if you are, I don't know what China is like, I've never been there, but in India, everyone, everywhere is, like this. And, on the Delhi metro, for example, long journeys, you're looking, and I look over people's shoulders to see what they're doing, but what they're looking at is actually very traditional. Religious books just in audio form. Movies which were made for the big screen, but you're seeing on this little screen. I don't think we've started making in Bollywood little screen movies. And so I'm kind of disappointed that this availability is there, but what you're looking at is actually very traditional.
Yeah.
That's kind of really disappointing. And I think maybe, and again, you guys know better, you have to create things for this environment. I mean, in education, you're digitizing textbooks. I mean, how boring is that? And you're putting QR codes on different chapters. And we are in India delighted that we've now digitized everything. But what you've digitized was kind of like boring to begin with. So how do you create stuff? I mean, I feel like these machines are way ahead of us.
Yeah.
And we're getting more and more left behind.
Yeah.
And if I'm reading like a religious book on phone, I mean, I could have God come in there and just like wow me or do something else.
Build for the device, yeah.
It's like, so we need better ideas of what you're going to be doing. A billion people just looking at stuff which is boring. I mean, that's really sad.
Well, with that, I think that's a really good segue into asking the audience some questions. We have microphones on both sides, so please, if you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, go ahead.
I mean, you can ask questions to each other as well.
Yeah. Please.
Hi. Thanks so much for your talk. This is really interesting. I work in Google Research. We're really interested in how we can provide assistance to teachers and students through sort of intelligent, like differentiated instructions. So thinking about like tutoring, thinking about teaching assistants. And I think we touched on this a little earlier in terms of ways we can enable differentiated instruction. And there's a lot of buzz about like personalized learning, which is a bit of an overloaded term. I'm curious how that, like what opportunities there are for differentiated instruction in India, what some of those pitfalls might be, and yeah, where it could go with that.
I think differentiated learning in India, my perspective is that, as Rukmini was mentioning, there's like very basic issues right now where, 50% of students in the 5th grade can't really read at the 2nd grade. And when we think about the classroom setup, I think we understanding where the student competency is or proficiency is, and you being able to customize instruction through technology, I think it holds a lot of potential. I think the challenges are still pretty fundamental there, which is like even the devices are not available, the teachers are not ready to use technology in class. So I don't have a good answer to it, but I'm curious what Rukmini thinks about it.
So, I mean, if I define it a little bit broadly, one is the situation that we just described where you have a lot of kids who've been left behind. And so how do you put in place mechanisms that can help them to catch up to be at a kind of a basic, equity level, right? So that's one kind of mechanisms that you can have in place. Some of the things that we do, without technology, but perhaps technology could assist, is called teaching at the right level, where I reorganize my groups of kids by their level of basic reading or math, and not by grade. So, those mechanisms I'm sure, can be there and can be organized. But I think the more interesting one is how do I free up people to go on different paths afterwards? And how can you do that unless the system allows you at the exit level to certify that, right? So right now in India and in many countries in Africa, you have a school leaving exam. And that really puts an end to any kind of differentiated anything. You've got to all be proficiency only in that. So I think that the key reform efforts get stymied because you may do a lot of interesting stuff in the middle, but you have to end up with that. So unless we can really open up some differentiated ways of exit, then I think it's going to come through. I think that getting everybody up to a certain level, because then you can build from there, is one kind of challenge. But what is the pathway beyond that needs, I think the key one thing that if I had to change in India would be to change the school leaving exam. And already it's kind of irrelevant because most universities do their entrance exam. So it's like you take an exam to get out through the door and you take another exam to get in through the door. That's clearly, again, a real waste of time. And at that moment, you should be actually out in the park, romancing your girlfriend and not taking all these stupid exams. So, there's a lot of opportunity cost in this.
Yes.
At a very critical time in your life when you have, at my age, give me 5 exams, I have nothing better to do, but at that age, we have the kids to do more.
Years, yes. Another question?
So one thing that strikes me about the example activities that you showed in this talk is that they're all kind of device-centric. So like you've got a group of children here and they're all working together, but they're all staring at maybe they're looking at the camera, but it looks like they're supposed to be staring at the tablet. And the problem with that is kind of twofold. One is that if you want to integrate it into the education system, you then need to get the teachers on board. You can't just take a tablet with the app and drop it into a classroom and have the teachers continue to do what they do and get any benefit. And then the other is, it takes people away from what they were going to do otherwise. So one thing, years ago, I ran a team for the Global Learning X Prize and tried to build something different and advance in the competition, so I dropped it. But I'm kind of surprised that people haven't picked this up more, which is why aren't there more products that are designed to help people do the things they're going to do anyway. So in the case of literacy, it's kind of quite clear what that would look like, which is you take your material you want to read, be it a book or a sign, you take a photograph, and then it helps you read it. It highlights, the letters that you're reading that map to each phoneme and says them one by one. That asks you to read it out and tells you how well you're doing, converts whatever's in the photo into a comprehension exam, this kind of thing. Like, I just don't see much development in that way. And I mean, why is
Good question,
I guess.
why?
Yeah, like, why is everything device first rather than whatever you were doing first? Let's put it that way.
I mean, I think that here this photograph must have been taken to send to the person who paid for the device, because a lot of the time the device is actually put aside. And the project that you're doing, you do a whole set of activities in which your connection to the device may be one of them. But I agree with you. I think that there are two ways, I think. One is, how could you do what you were going to do anyway better? And how could you do different things? And I think part of what, at least some of the things that we are doing is, how could you do different things? Because what you were doing anyway was, one way of doing things. But this, for example, across the country, kids discovering the world around them and being able to archive it is not an activity that is normally done. Because you think about some kinds of content or knowledge as being important, but not the stuff around you. So if this device is a way in which you can go explore and then bring back and put in here for other people, then perhaps that's one way of thinking about what you're doing differently that this is enabling, that this whole structure is enabling you to do. But Madhav, would you like to add to, because he's done quite a bit of thinking on this,
You're right. I mean, this program is different from, if you took the device away, you would have a program which Pratham runs anyway. It's called Our Village, and where kids get together and have a library and do their activities. So the device is really not required. What the device does is adds another dimension, and the kids start feeling that they belong to a new time and want to do many different things. So earlier when we started out, the thinking was the device is a carrier of knowledge where you can take videos and games and give to the kids. We learned very quickly that kids actually want to do something with the device. Apart from watching videos, they want to make their own videos. They want to create their own knowledge, which they could not do earlier. So for example, when we held workshops for script writing, everybody wanted to come because they wanted to know how to write a script for a video. But if you do the same thing for essay writing, nobody wants to turn up. So actually, wanting to connect with the new technology is a big motivator. I can tell you, we did a control versus treatment assessment of standard curricular stuff, not what we had shown on the tablet. And we find that although the curricular stuff was not taught in these programs, the treatment group actually scored something like 15 percentage point higher than the control group, without any teaching. So clearly the motivational factor starts kicking in, that I'm doing something. This whole desire to learn, which has gone away because somebody's teaching me rote learning, and here I'm interacting and I'm doing something different, less about the curriculum that's on it, but more like my motivation to learn. I'm doing something by myself. I think that plays a huge part in this. So that device is sort of a nudge. And then it's also a tool to do different things. And if you have more devices, you may be able to do much more. But the important thing is it's not to be treated only as a one-way carrier of knowledge. As Rukmini was saying, it has to flow both ways. So that's why on the technology side, what we are trying to do with artificial intelligence is when kids send back videos by the thousands, like mangoes, how do you grade those videos? I mean, that's pretty simple on machine learning now, I'm told. So you give all those, so you figure it out. So I think we are trying to develop those technologies also. And then more that happens, the kids will benefit, and they will also figure out that this is how you have to get better videos made and so on.
All right, well, we have time now. We're gonna try to do both of your questions quickly. So let's start over here, and then just a couple more minutes, and we're gonna wrap up.
So my parents recently went back to India. They moved there, and you must know how easy it is to find domestic help. And they were quite surprised to learn that one of the people working there she was 12 years old, and her younger sister was also working there. She's 9. And my parents asked why they're not in school, and one of the big things is that they don't see role models, they don't see success stories around them. And I just wanted to ask you, like, you've been part of this initiative for about 25 years. Have you seen a lot of success, and have you seen that inspire like different groups in different places where you go? Or have you seen like people give those same excuses, that, oh, there's no one else that's successful, so how can I be successful? So have you seen that play a role, and how do you kind of combat that?
I mean, very quickly, it's unusual for a 12-year-old now not to be at least enrolled in school. And so I'd be curious to see, they're probably enrolled but not going. And the not going is often partly because what's going on, I don't get it because I'm left behind, or I don't see where it's headed, in both cases, both of which I think we've been talking about. But just some figures, in each age group in India, there's roughly about 25 million people. I mean, broadly, okay? 10 years ago, if you looked at 8th grade enrollment, it was about 11 million. Now, the latest figures, which may be a year or two old, it's 23 million. So not only are more and more kids actually enrolled in school, but they're also at least lasting longer. So at least up to 8th grade, people are connected to school in some way. And I think if what was happening inside the school was more interesting, then you would go more often as well. So write back to your parents and ask them to talk to the kid a bit more. Are they enrolled in school? When did they leave school? What was the reason, and so on? Because it's a little bit like they may have left because they were so far behind that they don't see a hope of catching up, and therefore they don't see a role model, or something like this.
Great question. All right, last question from the audience.
My question is to piggyback off of that. So in 2009, India enacted the Right to Education Act, which makes it compulsory from the age of 6 to 14 to go to school. But after that, you see high rates of dropouts. So how do you plan within your organization to mitigate those dropout rates?
So it's interesting that, again, from our ASER reports, we did one which was focused on the age group 14 to 18 in 2017. In that age group, we still see 85% of that age group still enrolled somewhere. And again, I would say that everyone has such high aspirations that you remain kind of connected to some kind of an educational institution for as long as you can. But in the same age group, 40% were actually working somewhere. And the working somewhere was usually with your family. This was a rural survey. So you either worked on your family farm. So you were doing, actually, the interesting thing is, you are in school or in college because you think that's going to lead you somewhere better than others, but you're not sure where that will be headed and not sure what you're actually learning. And the work that you're doing is not the work that you really want to do. So a real loss of, I think, opportunity there. This age group, I would say 18 is the age at which you can formally begin work in the organized sector. Right? I feel that this age group is the age group in which you could do a lot more, in which not just preparation for further school, if that's what you want to do, but I think a much broader preparation for life, for work, and for a whole bunch of things that our school system doesn't address. Because the school system is designed for that lot that we think is headed to college. And therefore, I think attempts like this hybrid learning or other things are to widen that experience in that age group. So that one, you see maybe many more types of things that people are doing that you may not see in your own village. But the other is also kinds of skills that are valued actually outside of the school curriculum that are extremely useful to you, like doing things in groups. We have, for example, a project that that has been very popular about find a problem in your village and try to solve it. And I mean, people have done all kinds of things. Those kinds of things, I think, are much more useful for what you're going to do beyond than just the simple enrollment in school.
But do you really think hybrid learning is the solution for this demographic of people to be skilled to enter the organized sector?
I think that the kinds of skills, like today, we run a big youth skilling program. About 30,000 kids or so are enrolled. Nobody looks at your curriculum and your school results at all. They look at whatever you're coming in to do. And there, things that are important are, can you communicate? Can you get along with other people? Can you follow instructions? That's not what you learn in school. So I'm not saying it's not important to go to school, because I think that has its own place. But to have the opportunity to learn a lot more broader breadth of skills that are going to be useful to you. I mean, most of our school kids have never worked with other people. Outside of school, you need to do that no matter where you are. And so, I mean, I'm not saying it's exactly only this, but I think opportunities to collaborate and to apply what you know to the world outside, I think is really key. Being able to get together and create stuff for yourself is going to be key. There are no jobs, and they're going to be even lesser. The organized sector is a tiny proportion of the workforce in India. But we pretend in our huge education system like that's the destination.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.